Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am Jerry Firestein, Senior Vice President here at the Middle East Institute, and I'm pleased to welcome you all to today's first MEI Climate Week observation, organized in connection with Earth Day, which is going to be this week on April 22nd. With this week of programming, we hope to illustrate the plethora of effects that can be seen across the MENA region and its environs due to climate change, rising temperatures, and increased desertification. We have a highly accomplished and diverse group of experts who will tackle different aspects of the climate crisis in the region, from preventing unlivable temperatures in Pakistan to examining the potential that green finance can mitigate the role of the private sector in emissions. Following today's talk, we will zero in on North Africa to see the role that activists and advocates have in building a more globalized movement for climate action. Tomorrow, we'll be joined by a group of young scholars from across the region to discuss how they see the present and future priorities in the field. That conversation will be moderated by MEI's own Eliza Campbell. To see future events for the week, please visit our website or the link in the description box. With our opening panel today, we'll take a macro look at climate issues facing the region, the human costs, the economic impact, and the consequences of inaction. We're pleased to have two excellent speakers for this panel, Ayat Suleiman and Omar Alarini, and the conversation will be moderated by Axios's Andrew Friedman. Andrew is an energy and climate reporter for Axios. He's a veteran climate change reporter who most recently served as an editor at the Washington Post, where he covered the record hurricane season of 2020 and the California wildfires. He previously served as science editor for Axios and in similar positions at Mashable, Climate Central, and other publications. Andrew holds a master's in law and diplomacy from the Fletcher School at Tufts University and a master's in climate and society from Columbia University. With that, I'll turn it over to Andrew. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me on this very active climate week, very busy week, to discuss some very critical topics, critical elements of these topics, especially. I am first going to turn it over to our two panelists who are going to have about 5 minutes to discuss what they specialize in and what they're seeing as some of the major challenges of the MENA region, and specifically kind of the lens that they bring to it. And then I'll ask some questions, try to get some kind of back and forth banter going between both of them, and then we'll open up the floor for audience Q&A. We'll be taking questions through Zoom's Q&A feature. To submit your question, please, you can find the Q&A feature on your Zoom screens, sort of down, it should probably be down near where the chat function is. You might be more familiar with the chat function. You can also ask questions by emailing events@mei.edu. So first, let me just introduce both of them. Dr. Omar Arini is Chief Officer of the Multilateral Fund Secretariat and former Senior Advisor to the Government of Egypt on the ozone layer and on climate change issues. And Ayat Suleiman is the Regional Director for the World Bank's Sustainable Development Department for the Middle East and North Africa region. First, I'm going to turn it over to you, Ayat Suleiman, to just talk for a couple of minutes, or if you decide you don't want to and you want to go right to Q&A, a little bit faster, you can do that too. So I'm going to turn the floor over to you for right now.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone. And it's great to see you, Dr. Omar. I've personally followed your journey in pursuit of these important sustainable development and climate issues in the Middle East and globally. So as you mentioned, Andrew, I work in the I head the Sustainable Development Department for the World Bank in the Middle East and North Africa region. And really taking a step back today and with the topic of our conversation around climate challenges, I really want to start by saying that MENA is at a crossroads. The challenges of climate change have been hitting MENA hard. It is one of the most vulnerable regions to climate impacts, and we can talk more about that. Yet the readiness and the resilience of the region to face these challenges and these risks is very low. And we can see that in a myriad of issues, whether it is around facing the temperature rise, the sea level rise, the increasing droughts and floods, etc. At the same time, in terms of the global dynamic around low carbon or decarbonization, the MENA region's ambition is low. And for that, it hits MENA in various ways, most importantly in terms of the transition to low carbon development being slower than its peers doesn't allow for competitiveness to happen at the level that it needs to happen for MENA to remain in the global trade regime the way it is on key areas and key sectors. Now, talking about this climate challenge, you look at that from the lens of what happened over the past year and a half in terms of the COVID pandemic and how it has impacted MENA, and you see that it is a double whammy. And that's why I'm saying MENA is at the crossroads. And I want to use my 5 minutes to just emphasize that the choices that MENA countries make today in terms of how they're going to recover from COVID and build economic growth and jobs in the next 2 to 3 years has to take into account the climate crisis. And frankly, with that, and that's the work we do also at the bank, there are a number of win-wins and a number of choices that allow MENA to gain in terms of the job dimension, the growth dimension, but also the inclusion dimension, because climate hits more the vulnerable groups and inclusion is at the heart of many of the fragilities in the MENA countries. So what kind of investments are going to happen to build the COVID recovery? Are they going to be green or brown? Are they going to be inclusive or exclusive? Will we build assets that will be stranded, fossil fuel assets in the next 5 to 10 years? Those are all the discussions and choices that happen. When you talk about bailouts or fiscal stimulus packages, are these geared towards green investments like we're seeing the European Green Deal, or how countries in Asia and others have invested in ways that at the same time create the economic momentum needed, but on the other hand also direct the investments in ways that build the resilience or create green jobs. Similarly, are we investing in human capital that can face these challenges in the future, is able to work in a green job market, or is able to face these challenges more? So those are the kind of challenges and work areas that we do in the Department of Sustainable Development in the World Bank and more broadly in the MENA region. I am looking forward to talking about areas and facets of that. We cover agriculture, water, urban development, social development, and environment, and of course the cross-cutting climate issue, which touches all these sectors, including also the human development sectors. And again, if we look more deeply, and of course Dr. Omar is more of the expert there, on the kind of impacts and issues that we are dealing with in different countries, whether it is in the food crisis in places like Yemen, or in energy transitions and the heavy fossil fuel dependence in many of the countries of MENA, it becomes clear that we have to think differently, and MENA countries have to take on this at this crossroad, a different way of approaching recovery, a different way of approaching development that takes into account climate and inclusive development going forward. Let me stop here, and I really look forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you so much. That's given us a lot to think about, and I was furiously taking notes while you were speaking. So I think a lot of those things are the things that we're thinking about in our coverage of these issues, both in the MENA region as well as elsewhere. So Dr. Omar, I'll turn it over to you now for 5 minutes of comments. And then after that, we will go to the discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Ayat, and for the opportunity to speak in this webinar. I was given 24 hours to respond to the invitation that came from Ms. Mabrouk, and I know that the MENA region has been studied over and over, still being studied, and considered not only by an institution such as the World Bank, but all the regional banks that we are aware of, and has been beneficiary of, in one way or the other, from international finance, either through the Global Environment Facility, the Multilateral Fund, the Adaptation Fund, and now and of course the Climate Investment Funds of the World Bank, and also lately the Green Climate Fund. I did not want to engage in details and statistics because everybody can have access to these, and in this respect, I say good luck because they are all over the place and you cannot really draw a picture. So I advised both Jessica and Mret that I will speak on governance, because I read all my career in the past 30 years was with international organization, international funds. And if the international scene is not set right, then we are wasting time. And I'll give an example. Next year, we will be celebrating Stockholm Plus 50, the 50th anniversary of the Stockholm Declaration on the Human Environment. And that led to the creation of the United Nations Environment Program. Between 72 and 92, all the major environmental agreement, including the UNFCCC, was established, was initiated by the United Nations Environment Program. And this happened in really politically and economically polarized world. Now our world is much better. It's not as polarized according major fault lines. Of course, there are polarization, but somehow we can talk to one another and we try to solve problems. Our attempt at solving problems have not really been very successful. We have been successful only in postponing the resolution of the problem. I chose a comparison between the Montreal Protocol and its financial mechanism and the UNFCCC and its financial mechanisms, etc. And to illustrate how the element of trust between nations and having the issue to be the in control of our goals, not that we as governments attempt to control the issue because of our domestic policies, our domestic industry, etc. The Montreal Protocol was agreed in 1987. And the UNFCCC was agreed in Rio in 1992, a five years difference. Both regimes were grounded in science with certain uncertainty. The mantra was, yes, we should err on the side of science, even when science is not perfect, is not absolutely certain. The same thing applies to climate, and you're all aware of the different modeling that had taken place almost since 1992, or even before actually, 1992 until today. So today we have more certainty as far as science is concerned. Why was the Montreal Protocol very successful? And I mean successful in the sense of universal compliance with all the control measures that were applicable to both developed and developing countries. And the climate convention is suffering from one meeting to the other. I think the 28th meeting is coming up soon. And the meetings have succeeded in taking decisions. Actually, governments in many parts of the world, but especially industrialized countries, have taken actions that supersedes the first and the second commitments of the Kyoto Protocol. Kyoto Protocol, of course, is a witness of how politics could interfere with a very good agreement that could have introduced equality between all nations, developed and developing, to control the emissive industries, the emissive way of life that we all pursue in all our societies, rich and poor. We are still struggling in the climate regime because we have no compliance commitment. There is no commitment for compliance as it was in the Montreal Protocol. The Montreal Protocol followed a very simple formula. Developed countries were the cause of the ozone hole, or the actions that caused the ozone hole, and therefore they had to shoulder their responsibilities, and then the common and differentiated responsibilities came into being and was applied. Developed countries said, yes, we admit this, and therefore we'll go ahead with implementing the control measures agreed by all of us, and you developing countries will give you grace period of 10 years to adjust. During the grace period, we will finance on grant basis all conversions that your industries will have to go through. And by the time you approach the application of your control measures, you'll be ready to shoulder your responsibilities, just like the developed country. It worked beautifully. It took 5 years to build confidence between the two parties, between the two sides, and now it is working like clockwork. All the countries, more than 192 countries, are in full compliance with the Montreal Protocol and of all of its amendments. We don't see this in the climate change regime. Actually, when we were on the verge in 1997 of having something similar to the Montreal Protocol, and I refer here to the Kyoto Protocol, just in 2011, the powers to be said, no, we don't want anything imposed on us or on our industries. Everything should be voluntary, and we need 5 years to negotiate either a protocol, another protocol, or a legally binding outcome. And then you got the Paris Agreement that was neither a protocol nor having the elements of any legally binding commitment. It's what we call nationally determined contributions. I think I would be able to reduce my greenhouse gas emission by so much by this and that year. This is the developed countries. On the developing countries map, they said, yes, we can do this, and I'll give one country in North Africa as an example for that. And that was, and I think I'm allowed to say this because this is public information, Morocco. Morocco said that in order to implement my my contribution, I will need $60 billion. I will manage to raise $30 billion, but then the rest of the money will have to come from international community. And just imagine Morocco asking for that much money. You can imagine the rest of the developing worlds. And we are talking here about 150 developing countries who are eligible to receive this international finance. So the existing formula, I don't think it will work. I think governments in many parts of the developed world will be ahead of any compliance regime. The fallback or the drawback from this, that they can go back to the status quo ante if the status quo is really achieving large reduction in greenhouse gases, because there is nothing legally binding here. So I want to end by saying that without really a compliance regime that applies to all the countries, I don't think this effort will yield what is being desired by all of humanity. And Mr. Sulaiman just talked about few examples of the suffering that already exists in the MENA region, not talking about sub-Saharan Africa, not talking about all those countries that they are really working very hard to develop. And if you take a country like Bangladesh, for example, they are actively engaged in to celebrate their graduation from least developed country status. Soon it will be followed by Ethiopia and other countries. They will not stop there. They want to develop. They want to have energy sources. They want to have enough food supplies, and they also want to have jobs, i.e. export markets. So this paradigm is not sustainable and will have to be modified. And the only modification, according to my experience, will happen or will start happening if you really have a compliance regime that all countries must be committed to adhere to. I will stop here. I can talk more, but I will stop here. And again, thank you very much. And Andrew, by the way, I'm not the chief officer. I'm the honorary chief officer of the Multilateral Fund. I was the chief officer of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You know, it's interesting that you raised the compliance issue, because I mean, I don't think anybody expects there to be a binding compliance regime that comes out of the Paris talks anytime soon. But what does seem to be happening, that we've been writing about more, that I think we're going to see much more about in the press, is monitoring satellites that are going to be able to allow different countries to at least monitor where countries are in relation to their NDCs with much more accuracy. So we'll be able to pinpoint a particular factory or a particular region in China that is emitting higher amounts of greenhouse gases just from day-to-day satellite monitoring. That's an effort that Al Gore is participating in. That's an effort that the company Planet Labs is also participating in with the state of California. So there are some things that are kind of happening that go towards that, but that are not a binding measure like we had with Kyoto. I wanted to ask you to get at the stakes a little bit more starkly, because, you know, on the climate impacts front, we've already seen a civil war essentially break out in Syria that was influenced by drought conditions that were made more severe and more likely by climate change. There were many other reasons for the conflict, but it didn't help. And it was one of the precipitating factors. You mentioned the low resilience of the region and the vulnerability. So I guess, what are the risks involved as you see them in making the wrong choices now, compared to the payoffs from win-win strategies, be it in Egypt, in other countries in the MENA region. And then after that question, I'll go, there's two questions that the audience has submitted. Both of them are quite good. So I will then be able to lean on them for those two good questions after that.
All right, thank you, Andrew. Let me try to address first your question around the risks, and I'll try to weave in, I see the questions as well, I'll try to weave in some of the dimensions that were asked, especially around population growth and governance into what I share. So first, let's talk about physical risks and what that translates to in terms of vulnerabilities. And as Dr. Omar said, it is available. Everybody can Google it in the literature and in the modelings that have happened. But just to put that into context in terms of what it means for the economies of MENA and for the, as we especially mentioned, for the vulnerable groups. So changes in temperature are expected to increase in the next century by up to 4.9 degrees Celsius. That is depending on which model you take and what range you take. But if you look at that, that could mean that for a place like Iraq, the mean temperature by 2100 could reach 8 degrees more in a place which in several months records the highest temperatures on Earth. So you could imagine what that means to the ecosystem and to the livelihoods of people. Similarly, rainfall is expected to reduce by an average of 8 to 10 millimeters in coastal areas, and in some of the more drought-prone areas, about 40% less rainfall is expected, including, for example, the Moroccan highlands, which is one of the key areas also for agricultural production. And then when you look at sea level rise, which is critical for a region that has a large number of coastal population, we're looking at somewhere between 0.4 and 1 meter sea level rise, again, by the end of the century. In places like Tunisia, if you look at the satellite maps, the erosion and the coastal erosion is happening as we speak, and you can see that it is taking on a great toll in terms of the coastal economies, including fisheries, tourism, and livelihoods of other ways. So that's in terms of the physical risk. Now you translate that into economic risk, and I haven't talked about all of the dimensions, but it is a very hydrocarbon dependent economies, the majority of the economies. And I want to say something about the emission profiles. It is important to note that MENA countries, by and large, with a few exceptions, are low emitters. But per capita, the emission profiles is increasing in a very rapid way, with several of the countries like Oman, UAE, or even Morocco showing an increased per capita emission, which means that the profile of the economic production is not decarbonizing as it should. Then you look at the subsidy regimes of energy and food, and it's highly subsidized in a place where, again, the vulnerabilities are high and the food systems are very fragile given the water scarcity. And just to talk about water scarcity, 60% of the MENA region live in water-stressed places, either water-stressed or highly water-stressed. And the impact of these continued water stresses and what I shared in terms of the changes in precipitation could mean 6 to 14% of GDP. That's actually a World Bank report that we recently published on water scarcity in the MENA region. So again, all of these are meaning that the fragilities that we see in many countries can increase significantly in the next period. I want to talk about another risk and what is at stake from your question, Andrew, And that is what we call the transition risk. And I think it sort of answers a little bit also why, even if we don't have binding global agreement, the impetus for change is upon each of the countries to really make that transition, because the risk is high for not doing that. I talked earlier about the transition risk in terms of trade impact, but let me go a little bit more into that around what it means for MENA countries. So really, there is macroeconomic vulnerabilities in many of the MENA countries, as we know, are fiscally constrained. Excuse me. At the same time, many of the producing sectors are linked to global trade regimes that are seeing a decarbonized path, especially with trade with Europe, the carbon border adjustment tax that will be hitting several of the MENA countries in significant ways. Carbon intensive economies and fuel exporting countries such as Iraq, Libya, and GCC are highly exposed to these changes. And we are seeing some, I mean, we did some analyses, and it shows that, for example, some of the most oil, the high oil producing countries like Iraq and Libya are the least prepared for this carbon transition. High exposure and low resilience, meaning they are very exposed to the transition risk, being, of course, fossil fuel producers, and they have very low resilience, both in their fiscal model as well as in their physical infrastructure to adjust to these changes. So that's why really there is, and maybe I should preface that or sort of caveat that by saying we need to understand better these transition risks. I'm giving a blanket statement, but what we are trying to do in the next period, in fact, is work with many of the MENA countries to make it more granular in terms of who would be winners and losers in lifting certain subsidies, in adjusting the industrial production system in ways that allows them to be more competitive and greener. Because there will be, in some instances, there are some of the scenarios that are, you know, obvious win-win, but there are others where there are certain trade-offs. And what we could try to do to help as the World Bank, and we're doing that in many of our analytical work areas, is to try to quantify these transition costs and who will be most impacting, including impacts on the more poor and vulnerable groups. Let me stop here. And I think maybe just to say that when we look at, it's absolutely critical that governance structures exist within countries and also at the global level to work with these mechanisms. I think what Dr. Omar shared, for example, on the Kyoto Protocol and the Montreal Protocol in terms of clear and well-structured governance systems and a link to financing systems helps a lot. What we're trying to look at in terms of the country capacities to address some of these transitions and transformations that are critical for MENA to, you know, catch the bandwagon and not be making the wrong choices at this crossroads, is to really look at the capacity of the key institutions. And that does not mean ministries of environment alone. It has to be the ministries of finance, the whole of government approach, the integration between sectors and the coordinated approach across sectors for working. Then looking at financing and the prioritization of financial decisions within a country that is linked to climate action and climate ambition. And that's why it's critical also to be very transparent with data, to share information in a way that allows for people to understand why these choices are critical. So the governance dimension is extremely important in that regard.
Dr. Omar, do you have any comments regarding what was just said or the questions that were asked?
Well, just take it from what he had said. I mean, talking about the MENA region, that actually it can find parallels in the Latin American region, for example. And I don't want to mix the internal situation with the problem itself, because if you start talking about financial restructuring and subsidies and all of this, again, what should come first? What I'm advocating, and I would like to use this word, is you really have a paradigm shift for development. I mentioned two large countries, relatively speaking, Bangladesh and Ethiopia. Should they follow the same model of development, for example, that was followed by China or even India? I think we are all doomed, because the rest of the developing countries who are in similar situation would do the same. So we're using the same economic parameters to address a problem that's new, and let's admit that this is a new problem, that its solution might not be conventional, that we haven't tried really very seriously how to solve the problem. You cannot prevent hurricanes, for example. Andrew, you said that the technology is such that through satellite imagery, they can pinpoint an emissive industry in China, but you haven't actually said anything about the repercussions of this, how international law will view this. So we should not go into these complexities. I think the world is equipped to seek a paradigm shift in the way it does multilateral business. The granularity of specific countries, yes, it is taken into consideration by the country itself. And any adjustment as a result of a new international regime or international system will have to be undertaken within that international system. So without this paradigm shift, I think actually all the efforts, all the trillions of dollars being spent would be done on ad hoc basis, and you would end up having the have-nots and those who have it all. But unfortunately for everybody, climate change has global coverage. It's not specific to one region or one country or group of countries. So I think we need to really think outside the box. And multilateralism proved to work if there is the political will to make it work. And I really gave the Montreal Protocol because this is the shining example for all of us that demonstrated the will to succeed. Just imagine talking about the ozone hole to an ordinary person. It's something that you cannot imagine. Even the impact of the ozone hole and the effect of the ultraviolet radiation is not perceptible except if when you go to the polar region or the Alps. So it is very specific research that can find out. But humanity as a whole rallied around this, and they made a success out of it. I don't see any reason except the avarice, and excuse me in using this word, of the big capital to make more money and to dominate. This underlines the word dominate. As long as there is a sector of humanity that have the dogma, the belief, the strong belief that they must dominate, I think we're all doomed, no matter what we'll do. So within our means, I think we should really work for a new multilateral system with its control measures that are applicable to everybody. And we have to do this now. I had mentioned some predictions, but after 80 years. And all of us here, unless there is a new invention, will be gone. Would be gone. People would like to see facts on the ground, and they are not seeing it. They are not seeing it. So this is my reaction to what was being said. And I know I am the odd person out here. I speak like an NGO, but please allow me to pursue the way I respond to questions in this manner. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I don't think you're the only person to have some to have that view and to have a more I don't know if I'd call it pessimistic, but view towards the giant things that are needed compared to what is actually taking place right now and looks like it will take place. That brings me to, before I get to Bill Law's question, which is in the Q&A queue, I'm curious as to what either of you are expecting this week in Washington, and coming from international capitals. We have the virtual White House Climate Summit Thursday and Friday, which is meant to raise ambition for 2030 targets. We think we know what the US target is going to be, somewhere around a 50% reduction relative to 2005 levels by 2030. We think we know what Japan's target will be. We, meaning myself and fellow reporters. And it'll be a little bit more, they'll step up more relative to the 2013 baseline. We don't expect any new major commitments from China, but they may talk a good game, a better game, which is serious progress. And Canada is the other country that a lot of people are watching pretty closely. So I wrote a piece this morning, or that ran this morning, about how the US is the biggest stumbling block to the US's own efforts to lead on this issue, because we have now helped negotiate and then left 2 major climate treaties. So why should the world trust our word anymore at this point, or get too involved in a system that we have designed, or that depends on us? But my question really is, what do you hope to see this week and beyond this week towards the Glasgow negotiations, both from the World Bank perspective and then from a more NGO perspective of looking at it from a MENA standpoint, like relative to what that region is experiencing and may experience and really needs in terms of raised ambition? Did that question make sense? First to you, Ayat?
Sure, I'll try. Look, I think, you laid out the complexity of the global landscape, no? And which we have all experienced, especially in the last 5 to 6 years, which has been a very bumpy road. I would say, and I would disagree with you in terms of capitalizing on the momentum and the positive shift that has happened in the last few months. I think it's extremely important for all of the world to capitalize on, to try to go to Glasgow with renewed ambition, with renewed optimism, and a clear path towards how do we get the Paris alignment across the countries. And I do think that there are, the signals you mentioned of the US targets, Japan, China, and others. I think the aggregate of that, we need all of that and much, much more, of course, to make it. And I do think that that is critically important in terms of the broad signal. Now, let me take that to our own institutional approach and targets, where, of course, climate is at the center of the work we do. It has been, and it remains critically important. As you probably know, the World Bank, in its last 4 to 5 cycles of financing fiscal years, has achieved co-benefit targets of climate change of about 30%. And actually, in the last year, despite COVID, has also reached 32%. We are aiming in the new climate action plan globally to reach 35% of our investments and financing to go towards climate targets, and 50% of those to address adaptation challenges in developing countries. what we are trying to do in MENA countries, where we are also developing a climate action plan for the next 4 years, is to translate that to the realities of MENA. Same approach to our investment targets, 35% co-benefits and 50% for adaptation, but also a critical look at what it means in terms of national policies. And again, there, of course, NDCs drive national ambition. They do determine that. What we would like to do is work with the countries and define where are these opportunities for scale up, the opportunities for doing more in the next time frame. And again, as I mentioned, taking into account that much of that will happen in a recovery phase from a global pandemic that is hitting hard MENA countries. Most of the MENA countries have had negative growth in the last year and a half, with a couple of exceptions, in fact, including Egypt. But all of them have been hit in terms of the flows of investment, the ability to address job creation across. So it brings me back to sort of these, the look at transitions, the look at transformations across. And if I can just highlight the 4 areas where we want to focus our work, and then I want to give a couple of examples, because I do want this to be landed in the reality of what it means for people. So the 4 areas of transformation that we do want to focus on in our work is food systems, and coupled with water management and ecosystem management. That is critical for MENA countries, where many countries are dependent on food imports, and food security has actually seen an increasing fragility with the global value chains during COVID. So how do we transform food systems? How do we make them more resilient to climate shocks? And how do we balance that, do the balance between supply and demand in different countries, and also at the sub-regional level. The second one is energy transition and low carbon mobility. And I think there the discussion is quite broad. I'm hoping that some of your other sessions will address these discussions, because it's actually quite a rich one. It's complex. It has the fossil fuel producing, the dependent, and but interesting facts around there is that the most recent solar power trade was actually issued with the lowest price in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia had the lowest price for solar powered systems, and that gives hope for the market signals and a shift that could happen, with many, of course, of the countries having gone that way. But I think the potential out there is much, much more. The third area is climate resilient cities and coastal economies. And there, as I mentioned, the vulnerabilities of the coasts of the Middle East is quite high. And cities where the population, of course, the majority of the population, MENA is one of the most urbanized regions, those cities are not equipped to address the heat bubbles that will happen, but also the shifts in jobs and the shifts in the ecosystem that will happen in a world of the future. And I agree with Dr. Omar that many of these changes are happening today. If we see how, for example, urban centers have evolved just in the last 10 years, I think we cannot wait for the full impacts that we expect of climate over the next decades and century, if you want to say that. And then the last one is on the full transition across the economy. I mentioned the role of government, the role of fiscal policies, and also the role of financing. And there I want to say that even if the global mechanisms provide the framing of what the rules of the games are, and it goes back to your question, Andrew, what are the expectations? It is critical that we create the incentives for the private sector and the capital markets to act in a way that attracts the investments towards the green investments and the sustainable investments. That includes, sovereign wealth funds. It includes the capital market. Countries like Egypt issued their first green bond last September. Can we do more of that? And can it be based on a set of investment portfolios that really makes that shift for the countries, but also allows FDIs to flow in a more sustainable way going forward? So there's a lot of those work areas. We are capitalizing on all of that in our new climate action plan for the next 4 to 5 years. And I really invite everybody who is attending this webinar to connect with us, interact with us on how we can make or deepen some of these areas going forward. I just wanted to mention that because many of our programs in places like Morocco, who have issued their green generation agriculture strategy, or in Egypt, where we're working on air pollution, or in Iraq, where we're working on the water challenges, or Yemen on food security, many of these programs are what, at the end of the day, countries need to focus on get that transition right and to get that transformation right in a context of a global, of course, pandemic, as I mentioned earlier.
And Dr. Omar, if you want to add any quick thoughts to that before we get to the next question.
Yes, thank you very much. I agree with what Ayat has said, but with due respect, I don't see anything new here. I mean, the multilateral financial institutions have been doing this. I mean, the accent is different here, or the focus is different, because this is the nature of the game. But we're talking about the future. We are not talking about we're not talking about the immediate future here. We are talking about the future, and we are part of this global future. So I go back to the same thing, which is becoming a mantra for me: multilateralism. It's a global problem that would need global solution. What we have succeeded in the international community so far since 1992 is to raise the level of awareness in developing countries, and indeed in developed countries, but primarily in developing countries, because you look at the sub-Saharan Africa, for example, where the access to electrical power is less than 30%. And when they have 100% access to electrical power, with the fastest demographic growth in the world, you can imagine the impact of this. Just to have the natural right to have electrical power, what the impact of this will be on the climate system. These are issues that we need to look at it from a global perspective, and I don't need to wait for 2050 or 2100 because we have the means, we have the finance, and the private sector is working with governments or with partners in developing countries. And we are seeing the rise of private sector in some developing countries that it did not exist 20, 30 years ago. And this is a positive sign. But you want the private sector and the multinationals to be part of this multilateral system. Multilateralism will not work if it is restricted only to governments. It will really have to encompass the partnership of the financial institutions, and I'm not saying this in the sense of financial institutions being implementing agencies of international agreements. No, as full partners, and we're seeing this very successfully in the Global Fund, for example, which is the World Bank is a full partner there, and the Gates Foundation is full partner there. We have not seen this at all in climate or in ozone or any of these global issues. This is the paradigm shift that I am advocating, that it has to be inclusive. The governments, in my opinion, they have failed. They have been talking for 30 years, almost 30 years. June next year, it will be 30 years since Rio in 1992. And what do we have as a result of this talk, except more forests that were erased? So I really would like to emphasize this paradigm shift in the way we are doing, the world is doing business. How long will this take? Whether it will ever take place or not, I have no idea, but I'm hopeful. There is readiness everywhere. Climate change is part of the daily vernacular, even my small village in Egypt. And this is, even as small as it is, but it is a very positive sign. We have to capitalize on this and really have a world leadership that can see that everybody is included in this effort. It will reduce time, it will increase equality, and it will build trust, because we only have one Earth and one climate.
Thank you. One last question from Bill Law, who writes in: to what extent does the authoritarian nature of most MENA regimes either create problems or provide solutions to the climate crisis? This can be to either.
Sorry, I was typing. I'm sorry, I was typing something for as a response to just give the email of our climate focal point for MENA, just in case anyone wants to reach out for any follow-up, please do. But let me answer that question by saying, look, I think what we want to focus on, and I do think that what Dr. Omar shared provides that example clearly, is that we have clear commitments and we have a path forward. And for that, you need strong institutions, you need a governance structure, and you need transparency and the engagement of the people. If you can create that ecosystem, and we've seen countries across the range of, from ones that are strong, centrally controlled, to others that have a much more, clear governance structure, we've seen both sides succeed. I do think in this case, and given the risks at hand, what is important is that you have a clear approach to what you want to achieve in terms of increasing the resilience of your economy, increasing the low carbon trajectory of your sectors, and doing that in a way that is transparent, is just, and is inclusive. And I think that's where the challenge comes. We cannot make it at the cost of some groups that are already vulnerable or lagging behind, or at the cost of some regions or sub-regions. We have done a study, for example, in MENA on lagging regions and the conversions and diversions spatially between regions. And it's extremely interesting to see how the fiscal policies of governments can actually cause certain regions to continue to lag behind, or to lag behind even further. So I think that's what we need to take into account when we advise governments and when governments make these policy commitments.
Great, thank you. Dr. Omar, did you have anything to add?
Yes, I have something different from what I had said, because, well, authoritarianism is no longer unique to the Middle East. We have seen it during the previous administration in the United States. If you bring this to the scale of what we are used to, and actually, as far as the climate is concerned, it can be positive, because perhaps it has more immunity from the influence of vested interests, of lobbyists. I just can imagine China with fully democratic regime. I have all respect for their regime. This is their choice. And under the impact of lobbyists, I don't think you will have a coherent climate policy at all. Or if you have it, it will take years to evolve. So I want to separate this. Well, it's a political question from reality on the ground. It can be used for the evolution of better policies regarding climate change, whether it is in the MENA region or in other regions of the world.
Great, thank you. Thank you both of our panelists for joining, and thank you for MEI for hosting this discussion. I hope everybody goes to the MEI website to check out the other events that are coming this week, the other panels on discussions. There's some really interesting ones from just my perusal of the schedule during a very busy week in Washington and elsewhere. I think this is a really critical time to focus on the MENA region and other regions of the globe and how climate is impacting them. So I just want to thank you both, and thank you, Dr. Omar, for coming in with 24 hours notice and providing some very good comments. And just want to say thank you. I don't know if anybody from MEI wants to steal the mic from me and wrap up with a pitch on the Climate Week programming. But if not,